Thank you, Andrew, for that. I just want to start my screen share here. Let's see. Okay. Am I up and running with my PowerPoint? Can I get an affirmative?
Yes, we see the PowerPoint.
Excellent, thank you. All right, well, thank you again, Andrew, and to everybody at Monticello and the International Center for Jefferson Studies and the American Academy of Diplomacy for inviting me to speak today. It's a pleasure to be back at this wonderful conference. If you were here last year, you may recall I gave a broad overview of early America's troubled history of the destructive symbiosis of foreign meddling, foreign collusion, and partisan politics that all culminated in the War of 1812. This year, I thought it would be helpful to zero in on the election of 1796. The election had pitted Thomas Jefferson and Republicans who sympathized with France against John Adams and his Federalists who wanted a closer relationship with Britain. And Britain and France were at war. You'll need to remember that, or a lot of this information will just be noise. So France versus Britain, Jefferson and Republicans, France, Adams and Federalists, Britain. Foreign influence is the angel of destruction to elective governments, John Adams told his compatriots in his inaugural address. More than a nonpartisan warning, the line was a partisan accusation. He had just won an election rife with charges of foreign meddling and foreign collusion. Now, to understand the origins of Adams's accusations, we can travel to this part of the country on the borders of the Western United States and Spanish-held Louisiana. So in this region, the White and Arkansas rivers flow into the Mississippi, and the two tributaries are connected by this channel of water. Now, obviously, topography changes over time, making it difficult to pinpoint where this exact channel may have been, but it likely lands us right in this region. And in fact, we may be looking at the remnants of that channel or some iteration of it. So if we can imagine this channel connecting all the way to the White River, it's easy to imagine the events that I'll describe here. So on a fall morning around early October 1796, Georges-Henri Victor Collot sighted a large dugout canoe gliding down the channel toward his wilderness camp along the Arkansas River. On a secret reconnaissance mission for the French government, the spy had been expecting this arrival, but something was wrong. In the distance, he could see only two men in the boat. There should have been three. A couple of days earlier, Collot had sent his second in command, Joseph Vahon, who I'll just anglicize as Warren. Collot sent Warren and two guides to reconnoiter the White River. Collot would lead his remaining few men up the Arkansas, and the parties would reunite where the channel connects the two rivers. So Warren loaded his dugout canoe with supplies, and the group separated before dawn. 12 hours later, Warren and his two men reached the channel that would lead them back to the Arkansas. The trio pitched camp for the night. One guide went hunting while the other collected wood. They would float the channel and rejoin Collot on the Arkansas the next day. So they thought. Alone by the canoe, Warren spotted two Chickasaw natives approaching. One carried a cassetette, a deadly war club resembling a tomahawk. The visitors asked to trade food for rum. After some haggling, tempers flared, and one Chickasaw man jumped into the dugout to seize a barrel of rum. Warren sprang for his musket. The Chickasaw careened his cassetette toward Warren's head. The Frenchman jerked back and caught a murderous blow to the chest. He slumped almost lifeless to the canoe floor. One guide saw the violence from a distance, snatched his musket, and fired. The ball tore through the Chickasaw assailant's arm. The Chickasaws fled, leaving Warren near death in the canoe, undoubtedly with mangled internal organs and broken bones. 2 days later, about 9 o'clock in the morning, Cullot saw the two guides paddling toward his camp along the channel. As they came to shore, he discovered his companion sprawled at the bottom of the vessel, still fighting for breath and barely able to talk. One of the guides recounted the attack and swore that the Chickasaws were the same two men whom Cullot had seen periodically along his Mississippi journey, beginning 500 miles back in Illinois country. So the story afflicted Cullot. Was this something more than a fracas over rum? Had the attackers tracked the Frenchmen hundreds of miles down the Mississippi? Did the Chickasaw pair mistake Warren for him? He and Warren shared a similar build and dress after all. Did they want him dead? Or had somebody enlisted them to kill him? Somebody who knew about his secret mission? All of these questions ran through through Cullot's mind. You see, Cullot had traveled the Mississippi to gauge in the Mississippi Valley to gauge what kind of empire France could build in the West once it pried territory away from Spain and the United States. In fact, this first map that we saw that helped us locate Cullot's position on the Arkansas was one drawn by him. And he produced other maps and images, a lot of maps and images to document the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. Layouts of forts, major roads, rivers, trade routes, towns, homes, people, troops, living conditions, geography, topography. He was a fine artist and an excellent cartographer, and he documented it all. French rulers hoped to strong-arm their weaker Spanish allies into ceding Louisiana to them. They might then strip the United States of southwestern territory and resurrect the vast North American empire they possessed just over 30 years prior. Since spring, Cullot had traveled the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, reconnoitering British, Spanish, and US strength in western valleys. The French minister in Philadelphia, Pierre-Auguste Adet, had recruited Cullot for the mission. Adet despised the recent Jay Treaty between the United States and Britain. To him and his superiors, the treaty terminated France's alliance with the United States. As Adet saw it, France had freed the United States during the Revolution, and in return, he expected Americans to keep the British at bay in North America. Instead, as far as he could see, the US government had sided with the enemy, and France would have to intervene. With Cullot, Adet developed a two-pronged strategy. First, prepare the West to fall into French hands. Second, as Cullot put it, try by every possible means to bring about Jefferson's election as president. Cullot would promote Jefferson's presidency as he conducted his espionage in the West, and Adet would work the Northeast. The coming election would be close. Everybody knew that. Jefferson and his Republicans could count on the South and West, but Federalist frontrunner Vice President John Adams would almost certainly carry the North and Northeast. The unpredictable state of Pennsylvania would cast the deciding votes, a swing state in modern parlance. Republicans might take the presidency if they won Pennsylvania, and they might win Pennsylvania if Adet didn't ruin it for them first. Adet calculated that men who are devoted to us would vault Jefferson into office if France encouraged them. In September 1796, he traveled to Boston to take the pulse of Jefferson's fellow Republicans there in the heart of Federalist territory. He found a dispirited lot, ready to abandon the upcoming election to their adversaries. In his own, likely admittedly exaggerated words, he raised their downtrodden courage, revived their hopes, and he extracted promises that they would act with energy to appoint Jefferson president and to discard John Adams. 1 week before Pennsylvanians selected their vital presidential electors, a day sprang a letter into a Philadelphia Republican newspaper, something akin to an open letter, for he addressed it to recently named Secretary of State Timothy Pickering, but he intended it for the public. France would seize US vessels that carried prohibited wartime goods to their British enemies, he announced. Perhaps, he thought, he could threaten Federalist merchants into Jefferson's column with lost trade. While presidential electors were still pondering and deliberating their final choices, a day threw 2 more letters into print. Their implication: elect Thomas Jefferson and institute pro-French policies, or risk war with France. When Pennsylvania's popular vote tipped barely toward Jefferson, some disgruntled Federalists credited a day's strokes of diplomatic finesse. But it wasn't enough. Adams had plucked 2 electoral votes from the South and 1 from Pennsylvania. He snatched the Electoral College majority by 3 votes. If anything, a day had lost the election for Jefferson. Federalists rallied against the tawdry arts, as Abigail Adams called them, practiced against her husband by a combination of Jacobins, Virginians, and foreign influence. New England electors would sooner be shot than vote for Jefferson after a day's intrusion, cried one Adams supporter. While a day was promoting Jefferson's election in New England, Cullot and Warren languished in New Orleans, surrounded by bayonets. Suspicious of Cullot and Warren, Spanish officials had arrested the pair on October 27th and stuck them in a fort guardhouse, probably here. Warren had been slowly dying since his assault weeks earlier. Confined at New Orleans, he finally succumbed. Cullot buried his companion in the clammy soil. While imprisoned in New Orleans, Cullot convinced the Spanish governor that his enterprise would benefit Spain as much as France now that the nations had renewed their alliance. He had scribbled copious records about how to defend the region against Britain. He also possessed valuable intelligence about a vast conspiracy of British agents, their Native American allies, and British sympathizers in America who planned to attack Spanish forts. Secret sources had divulged the plot to him weeks earlier. Now, the conspiracy hadn't actually advanced very far, but a few ringleaders did relish its potential, especially the eminent Tennessee Senator William Blount. A Republican, Blount acted for money, not ideology. Desperately indebted, he eyed Britain as the savior of his tottering private empire in the West. Rumors swirled that France might reacquire Louisiana from Spain, something the British could not tolerate. Westerners, such as Blount, feared that France would close the Mississippi to them and possibly even incite slave insurrections in the region. Blount and Britain shared an interest in keeping France off the continent. Blount started to discuss the details with the new British minister in Philadelphia, Robert Liston. Captivated but cautious, Liston dabbled at the edges of the conspiracy. He vouched for the feasibility of the plan and sent one American to London to make the case to his superiors. Cullot knew few of the specifics of the conspiracy, and he got other details wrong, but he shared at least some of his intelligence with the Spanish governor while imprisoned in New Orleans. Impressed with Cullot's information, the governor paroled the Frenchman and shipped him back to Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, by early 1797, Cullot briefed a day and a Spanish diplomat, Marquis de Caserujo. Cullot informed them of the Blount conspiracy and other possible British aggressions, and he recommended strategies to prevail. Culo's information arrived at a perfect time for Irujo. Spanish rulers had begun to second guess their decision a year earlier to grant Americans access to the lower Mississippi River. They expected Irujo to stall the conferral. Spain couldn't yield the Mississippi because Britain was planning an invasion, Irujo explained to Secretary of State Pickering. Pickering demanded evidence for this claim, and Irujo had none other than the word of a French spy. But then he caught a break. That spring, one of Blunt's co-conspirators got drunk and began to prattle about secret correspondence he carried, a letter that outed Blunt and Liston. US authorities seized the letter, which landed in Pickering's hands by early summer. A devout Federalist, Pickering stared at evidence that the British minister was conspiring illegally with Americans to attack Spanish dominions from US soil. The letter damned Blunt, but it left just enough room for Liston to claim that Americans had tried to involve him in the plot, but that he disapproved. Anxious to exonerate Britain, Pickering accepted Liston's explanations. Enraged by Pickering's well, shall we say, selective naivete, Republicans lumped the secretary into the plot. Pickering was behaving in a very devilish manner, bellowed one. Another decried Pickering's collusive practices with the British minister. Still another rejoiced that Republicans could expose the criminality of the British minister and the partiality of our polite Secretary of State Pickering. House Republicans planned to drag Liston and Pickering down with Blunt. Even as the chamber impeached the disgraced senator and the Senate held impeachment hearings, James Madison preferred the term Liston's plot, refocusing attention on the British. The election of 1796 and its aftermath established a pattern of party line accusations of foreign collusion. Minority partisans accused the majority of wielding corrupt, foreign-supported power, while the majority alleged that their opponents cooperated with foreign agents to seize illegitimate power. For the first time in US history, majority and minority parties adopted strategies to wield foreign interference as an electoral cudgel, strategies that remain with Americans today and, as in times past, stoking their most legitimate fears and yet fueling their most outlandish accusations, perpetuating a cycle of partisan distrust. Thank you. And I should stop here to say, well, I have stopped. I should say here that I am happy to field any questions if anybody has anything they want to put in the Q&A box. So while if anybody has any questions that they want to put in while they're while you're typing them in, I should just follow up here and say that I had to leave a lot out of this. We could have jumped into the XYZ affair and the Alien and Sedition Acts. I talked a lot about Culot, and Culot was the principal target of the now infamous Alien Act, which allowed the president to unilaterally imprison, and deport any foreign national that he deemed dangerous. So this was a dangerous precedent of making the president, judge, jury, and executioner. And Federalists made no secret that Culot was one of their targets, and of course Culot would have been a legitimate target for targeting spies in early America, but Republicans saw this and quite rightly as an as a heavy-handed federalist attempt to seize political power. And so what we see with the Alien and Sedition Acts are Federalists really starting to to enter extremes when it comes to trying to fight this boogeyman of foreign influence combined with foreign collusion from domestic enemies. So a great question that's come up in our Q&A here is, hasn't our social media exacerbated this type of foreign influence? What can we do about this? And I think that's a terrific question. It's one I've thought a lot about as I've worked on the current book project that I'm writing, that this presentation will be a part of. Because the print media at the time was somewhat akin to our social media now. It was everywhere. Newspapers exploded in early America. It was a new technology, and nobody really knew quite how to wield it properly. And the newspapers at the time were very partisan. They made no pretense of not being partisan. And in fact, usually they were, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, for instance, established their own, they cooperated with a friend to establish a newspaper specifically to trumpet their views. And so there are a lot of correlations between print media at the time and this new aspect of social media, which of course Russia has exploited with the IRA, as it's called, the Internet Research Agency, which Robert Mueller, of course, addressed in his report to Congress, that Russia has been using to try to needle American differences. And so the question becomes, what can we do about this? And I think that obviously is the, $60,000 question, as they say. I think that the best way to target misinformation, and specifically misinformation from foreign governments, is the best that can be done is to allow factual information. And to, I think we are doing what we can do, that a lot of, for all of the guff that the press gets, for all of the talk right now about partisanship in the press, there are a lot of good reporters who are doing their best to put out facts and information and, fact check. And that's what Americans tried to do at the time. It's countering misinformation with factual information. But that's a great question, and it's one that continues to plague us. And I think that the question really specifically gets at a larger question at the heart of American democracy, which is, who are the sovereigns in the United States? Because of course, we consider the people the sovereigns of the United States. And in early America, people like Caseirujo, who I referenced, he is going to make a very, and earlier than him, Edmond Charles Genet, who was notorious for intermeddling in US politics. Both of those ministers came up with very subtle and creative arguments that we can do whatever we want in US newspapers. We can print whatever we want. It's a free press. This isn't some monarchy in Europe. You allow public discussion of all of these issues. And so we are simply taking our case to the true sovereigns of the nation. And they can debate that in the public sphere. And so that is among the reasons that John Adams called foreign influence the angel of destruction to elective governments, because it's particularly difficult to control in a free government with free press, where the people can not topple the government, but topple the ruling party every 4 years, if we're talking presidential cycles. So it's a very tricky question to deal with, and it's one that America has tried to deal with for a long time.